Hey guys, this is a lecture on chapters 4 and 5 so that those of you who don't have the book can access this and get the quizzes done on time. Also, just a little extra for those of you who might already have the book but just want a little extra info. There's a lot of stuff that's testable material in these chapters, a lot of vocabulary words, so just a heads up, we will not have a lecture every single week. But if there is information that I feel like it would be beneficial to have in a brief lecture, I might just highlight a couple of things and put that up. But I'll go over everything you need to know just for the people who don't have the book, just for this next week. But just heads up, this won't be every single week. Okay, so chapter 4, which is verbal messages, which is basically all about language and the words that we choose to use when we're speaking. So when you do finally get the book, make sure that at the very beginning of chapter 4, there's a bunch of vocabulary words that you will be needing to know, and I'll go over those now. So essentially, verbal language is made up of all the words and phrases in our language, or whatever language it is that you speak. So a language is a system of symbols used to communicate. Verbal symbols are the words we use to communicate thoughts and feelings. So make sure you know what a language is. Each verbal language consists of a lexicon, which is all the words and phrases within that language. Then the phonology, which is the sounds and the way that we pronounce the words. And then the syntax and grammar, which is the rules on how we put those words together and turn them into phrases and sentences. All people who understand a particular language are a part of a language community. So everyone who speaks English, no matter where they are in the world, are a part of the English language community. So people in Ireland, people in, in Europe, people in Canada. Anybody who speaks English is a part of the English language community. So language communities are then broken into what's known as speech communities. And speech communities are smaller groups that speak a common dialect. So speech community is based on the dialect. So it goes language community, then it goes subgroups, speech communities. So I would say that New Orleans has its own very special speech community because of the words and phrases that we use and our dialect. A dialect is a unique form of a more general language spoken by a specific culture or co-culture. So, like I said, New Orleans has its very own special dialect. You know, things like making groceries. That's an idiom that we use. That's another vocabulary word, idiom, I-D-I-O-M. Cold drink. All those kinds of things are little idioms that are a part of our dialect and the way that we phrase words and the way that the accents that we have. So language community is all the people who speak a language, which is broken into speech communities on how they're spoken, and then that's based on dialect and idioms. To break dialect down even more, you have what's known as an I dialect, which is your very own personal way of speaking. So you probably have little words and phrases that you try to put together and use all the time, and that is a part of your very own specific I dialect, which is very interesting. All right, so characteristics of language. Language is arbitrary. So remember, language is a system of symbols. So that means that those symbols are arbitrary. So I hold up these glasses. You know, think of the word glasses in your brain. Picture it. G-A-L-A-S-S-E-S, right? That doesn't look anything like what I'm holding right now. But we know when we see that word or when we hear that word, it is a symbol for something like this. So we're able to see it. That's what I mean by arbitrary. Language is also very abstract. So a lot of times, if you say the word pet, some people might think of fish, some people might think of dogs, some might think of cats. Okay, I get more narrow than that. I say dog. Okay, cool. But some of you might think of a boxer, some might think of a pug, some might think of a pit bull, or the last dog that you saw. So we still got a lot of different dogs in our brains, right? So now if I'm telling you, hey, I want you to see my dog, I want you to visualize my boxer. He's about 80 pounds, he's a light brown chestnut color, got a gray face, really cute, short tail, ears are floppy. So you're picturing my dog now. So I'm using language to get more and more concrete as opposed to abstract, because you might think of a boxer that doesn't look anything like my boxer, but I want you to visualize mine, so I have to give you more words so it's not as abstract. And that's where a lot of miscommunications can come in a lot of the time, is that we don't get concrete enough, or we don't have the same associations with words, so we're not seeing the same thing. We're not reaching that shared meaning that we need to. And then the last characteristic is that language changes over time. So think about Shakespeare, if you've ever read Shakespeare, Romeo and Juliet. People don't talk like that anymore. There's words and phrases in there that mean something completely different than what they do now. At the end of Romeo and Juliet, there's a phrase where Juliet wakes up in the tomb, sorry, spoiler alert, and Romeo's dead beside her, and he's, stabbed himself, and she sees the dagger, and she goes, "Oh, happy dagger." And I remember reading that in my freshman year of high school, and everybody kind of being confused by that, like, what does she mean by happy dagger? Turns out that happy used to mean lucky 500 years ago when that was written. So that was another way of saying, oh, how lucky it is that this dagger is here and I need to kill myself because I'm a dramatic teenager, right? So we don't use that same turn of phrase anymore. Happy is not synonymous with lucky. It just means happy nowadays. But even more recently, the development of technology and how fast that goes, we don't say VCR anymore, really. That's a very, very old word nowadays. We barely even say DVD player anymore. So there are words that are being added to our lexicon daily at this rate, and we got to kind of keep up. So it's important to think about your audience when you're communicating with people and understand that they might not know the same words and phrases that you know, because maybe they're just not quite as caught up, especially if they're not in the same generation as you. Okay, so now let's talk about the relationship between language and meaning, which covers two things: semantic meaning and pragmatic meaning. So semantic meaning and pragmatic meaning. So let's talk about semantic meaning. Semantic meaning is derived from the words themselves. So what the word actually means, like in the dictionary. So you can break semantic into two separate things. So semantic meaning has the dictionary definition, which is just that, the dictionary definition, and that is the denotative meaning, or the denotation. And then the other way that you can break up semantic meaning is the connotation, or the connotative meaning, which is the context or the culture that we have, the association that we have with the word just by, growing up. So dictionary definition is the denotation. That one's pretty easy. We understand, we'll take the word family, that's the book example, and it's a good one. So, you go look up what the word family means in the dictionary, right? Then you might think of, okay, well, what is the connotative meaning of that word? So, sorry, it's my dog. You want to be a part of the lecture? So the connotative meaning for family for you is going to be associated with the kind of family that you grew up with. So maybe you grew up with two parents and two siblings and a dog, right? But maybe the person beside of you did not grow up. Maybe they grew up being raised by their aunt or their grandma, or just a single parent and no siblings and no pet. So family for them has a very different connotation. Or maybe the person next to you grew up in the foster system. So family to them is vastly different from your association with family. So if you're associating the word family and trying to get somebody to see what you're seeing by saying the word family in a conversation, but they grew up with a completely different view of that word, you can see where a miscommunication might happen. So that's why it's important to consider semantics. So from there, you got to know what the pragmatic meaning is, and understanding both the semantic and the pragmatic meaning can really help you increase your skills as a communicator and a listener too. So the pragmatic meaning comes from understanding a message related to its conversational context. So if you think about it, when you're at the dinner table, you ask, "Can you pass me the potatoes?" So the semantic answer to that, which would be just from the words, would probably be, if you are able to, you would say yes. Right? And that would be it. You wouldn't pass the potatoes because you semantically answered that question. But the pragmatic response would be, sure. Or you wouldn't even say anything. You just pass them the potatoes. Because from the conversational context, you understand the pragmatic meaning of that was, hey, I need the potatoes. Can you pass them to me? I can't reach them. Right? So if you get the book, I'm not sure if it has the exact same example that I have, but there's a really good example on page 49 of Comm 5. It's probably something very similar, if not the same, in Comm 6. There's a little yellow box. You can kind of see it right there. And it has 3 phone calls, which kind of helps you understand more about the pragmatic meaning. But for time, I'm going to leave that. Okay, so that's the high points of Chapter 4. Please go back through and read over that so that I know that was a little rushed, but I want you to be able to have the quiz and this video not be like an hour long. So that's the high points of chapter 4, which is verbal messages. So now we're going to go to chapter 5, which is nonverbal messages. So if you think about it, when you think about communicating, you think about words. You think about chapter 4, which is all the stuff that goes into that, right? But there's so much more that goes into it, because as we learned when we talked about the communication process and the model of everything that goes into it, there's so much other interference that goes on externally and internally, that noise that we were talking about, external and internal, or physical or psychological noise and interference, all of that. That's the kind of stuff that plays into, and then the feedback, that we're constantly communicating. The feedback is really from nonverbal communication a lot of the time. And there's so many more channels nonverbally that a lot of times it's even more powerful than the verbal messages. So nonverbal communications consists of all the messages we send in ways that transcend spoken or written word. And nonverbal messages are cues we send with our body, voice, space, time, and appearance, so those are all the different channels, to support, modify, contradict, or even sometimes replace a verbal message, like a nodding of a head or shaking of the head for yes or no. So let's talk about some important characteristics with nonverbal communication. The first is that nonverbal communication is inevitable. It is going to happen no matter what. So this is where the idea of you cannot not communicate truly comes from. You cannot not communicate, because nonverbal communication is going to happen. Sorry, no matter what, right? So even by not sending a message, sorry, even not sending a message, like if you receive a text message and you don't respond quickly enough, the person that you sent it to is probably going to assume that you are either too busy or you're mad at them, you don't want to talk to them. So they're going to assume a message even when you didn't send one. Sometimes, we're not aware of what our face is doing in a conversation. Maybe it's like drifting off and the person can tell you're not really listening or paying attention or not really being a part of the conversation. That is the idea that it's inevitable, because our nonverbal communication is almost always going to give it away. We cannot not communicate. Nonverbal communication, this is number 2, second characteristic, is the primary conveyor of emotions. So when we are looking at how a person truly feels, we're going to really be looking at what their body is doing, what their face is doing, what their voice is doing. So especially if it contradicts what the verbal message is, we're going to typically believe the nonverbal communication. So if somebody's going like, I am not angry, their verbal messages are not angry, but their nonverbal message with their hands and their face and their voice, they're angry. So that's what we're going to typically believe, because there are more nonverbal channels than just the one verbal channel. So you have more evidence to support that they're angry, right? Nonverbal communication is multi-channel, like we mentioned when we were talking about at the very beginning: body, voice, space, time, and appearance. So there are lots of different ways that we can communicate non-verbally. Nonverbal communication is ambiguous. Just like verbal communication, a lot of times across cultures, nonverbal communication is also ambiguous. A furrowed brow could mean that you're mad, but it could also mean that you're confused. So you really do need to, a lot of times, add in other cues, other nonverbal cues, as well as the verbal cue as to what the nonverbal is truly trying to say. So let's talk through the different types. I'm just going to go through these pretty quickly just because they're very self-explanatory, but I just want you to be aware of what falls into what category. So the use of body is the first type of nonverbal, the first channel of nonverbal communication, and the technical term for that is kinesics. What falls under use of body is gestures. So if you use your hands a lot, we'll talk more about using your hands when we discuss public speaking in that unit, when we discuss delivery. Then you've got eye contact. So eye contact is a big one when it comes to cultural communication, because a lot of very direct cultures tend to favor more direct eye contact. are more assertive cultures, but when it comes to some more submissive cultures or more hierarchical cultures, a lot of times direct eye contact can almost be seen as a sign of disrespect. So it's important to think about, who your audience is, as always, when it comes to that kind of stuff, because if somebody doesn't give you direct eye contact, it might not immediately mean that they're not listening to you or they're not giving you respect. It might mean that they come from an upbringing or a culture or a place where that is considered disrespectful. So for them, they are being respectful to you by not doing that direct eye contact. But for here in our culture, typically we want to have that eye contact. It shows, that we're listening, that we're a part of the conversation, and it's a sign of respect as well. So then you've got facial expressions. What's interesting about facial expressions is that it is the one across cultures that is pretty typical when it comes to like the basic emotions, happiness, fear, anger. Most of the time, or sadness, a lot of those are pretty recognizable across cultures, just those basic emotions. A smile equals happiness. We're usually pretty good at discerning those basic emotions and facial expressions. But from there, that's where it does get ambiguous, when it goes outside the range of those basic emotions. Posture, which is your body orientation. You would not walk into an interview at your dream job. Let's say it's at, some big law firm, you wouldn't walk in and just like kind of sit back like this and just, have your legs sprawled. You'd probably sit up in your chair, try to have good posture, maybe fold your hands pleasantly, right, in your lap or something like that, to show that you're engaged, to show that you're respectful. You probably wouldn't walk in and sit down like it was your house or your bedroom, right? Someplace where you'd be super comfortable, because that's just, it doesn't sort of meet with that setting. Let's see. Then we have touch. What's interesting about touch is that typically we have some forms of touch that are very ritualized, like handshakes and things like that, waving. And then, of course, we have touch that needs to happen, like when you're at the doctor's office, they have to touch you. But for the most part, we don't really touch each other too much. Spontaneous touch is automatic and subconscious, but it's usually reserved for a lot more like friendships and intimate relationships. You usually don't touch unless it's like a handshake, somebody that you don't know, or if it's ritualized, like a doctor's appointment. So then we have use of body. Next we have use of voice, which the technical term is paralanguage. So all the things that go into paralanguage, or vocalics is another term for it, is how it's said, how it comes out of your mouth. So you got pitch, which is the highness or lowness of vocal tone. Volume, the loudness or softness of vocal tone. Rate, speed, which is the speed at which a person speaks. Voice quality, which is the timbre of your voice, or how your voice sounds. Morgan Freeman has a really nice timbre to his voice. Intonation is the variety and the melody of your voice. If you don't have any intonation, you are monotone, you talk like this, and it sounds almost robotic, and it's terrible to listen to. That's not having any intonation. Then there are vocalized pauses, which are ums, ers, likes, knows. A few of those are okay. If you know that you say something a lot, like, or or, if you say that constantly, that's when it can start to detract from understanding and comprehension. So that's usually when you should probably start trying to fix that. But a few here or there, totally normal. Okay, so next we have the use of space, which is proxemics. Proximity, proxemics. It refers to how space and distance communicate. So we have personal space, and there's a figure in your book. For me, it's figure 5.1. And so 1 to 1.5 feet is the very, the intimate distance reserved for partners, spouses, really, really close friends and family. Think people that you're fine sitting very closely to. Then you got zone B, which is 1.5 to 4 feet-ish. That's reserved for friends. Zone C is a social distance, and that is 4 to 12 feet, business associates and acquaintances. And zone D, which is public distance, that is reserved for strangers. We usually try and stay as far away from people that we don't know as possible. So think about being on an elevator where that is, where you can't be as far away from them as possible, and how we compensate for that by, you each go to your own corner. If 2 people get on, if it gets full, we're all facing the same direction so that we don't have to look at each other. So just think about how how much we do to try and adhere to these, because we don't want to be near people that we don't know. We try to adhere to these rules as much as possible, even though it's subconscious. We also have territorial space, which is the physical space over which we claim ownership. So this would be like our car, our office space, our house, our yard. So think about how awkward it is when, my mom has had her car broken into a couple of times, and so she goes, the next morning and she sees that her car's been broken into, or all her stuff's been gone through, and it's weird because that's her territorial space. Then you have acoustic space, which is obviously the sound, how far your sound can carry. So think about, when we're actually at Delgado, on campus, and we're sitting in a classroom and people are talking really loudly in the hallway. It's really aggravating that they're invading our acoustic space by talking super loudly in the hallway. Then we have the use of time, which is chronemic. So think about, how long does it take for you to respond to a message? Is it, even if it's in person, if it takes you a long time, that might kind of create some awkwardness within that conversation. But if it's like a text message or something and you take 2 days to respond, think about the message that might send, even if it's unintended. And then lastly, we have the physical appearance. Just think about it this way. You probably would not walk into that same interview at that law firm wearing your workout clothes or your pajamas, right? You would probably dress very smart, very professional, because you want them to view you a certain way. You don't want them to view you as somebody very casual and sloppy, right? You would walk in very particular with your choice of clothing. You probably look well groomed. So the clothes that we wear really do help people. That's probably one of the first things that people notice about us and start to make assumptions about who we are. They communicate a lot about us and how we groom ourselves and how we hold ourselves. So physical appearance does play into it. We'll talk a little bit more about specifics when we get into next week's information. That's the high points. Again, please go over that on your own, but that should be able to get you through the quizzes okay. And I hope that y'all have a really good weekend and that everybody was safe in the storms. Bye, guys.